It's your boy Captain Hunter coming at you again. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly appreciate it. Make sure that you do me a favor, hit that rate, subscribe, and share button. Hit that rate, subscribe, and share button. This particular video is going to go up on my LMH Consulting Services tab on YouTube. But the audio is going to go to Captain Hunter's podcast on the audio version. So if you're following me, right, so more of the police related videos are going to be going up on the LMH Consulting Services tab on YouTube or channel on YouTube, and more of men's related issues are going to be going up onto Captain Hunter's podcast. Both of those audios are going to be transcribed, or not transcribed, but they're going to be, taking the audio version, and I'm going to put those both on the audio version for Captain Hunter's podcast, so you just continue to listen. But if you want to see the videos and you're going to, if you want the police stuff, go to LMH Consulting Services. And if you want the more kind of talking more about social issues and how we develop ourselves as to be better men, because we now understand that men are certainly under attack, and under attack is probably a strong language, but there's a problem that has been now being acknowledged by some really smart people, PhDs, etc., that men are suffering. Let's just put it like that. And we're taking a look at what we can do in order to make men the best versions of themselves. We don't believe in whining and complaining, but we do believe in becoming the best versions of ourselves that we can be, and all that. But anyway, let me not get off into that tangent. So I want to talk a little bit about why are U.S. police so bad. So this is a video that I started to watch, and I said, I'm going to do a reaction to this because I started to watch it and just was not sure about it. So I want to do this particular video. So it's about 23 minutes. I'm not going to play everything. I'm probably going to stop and start, and I'll probably do a big heavy edit job. But this is the site where it is. This is the name of the video. Why are U.S. police so bad? And this is by Lady Leeja, Leeja Miller. I don't know who this lady is. It's got about, I don't know how many views it has. 339 or 261. It's got a lot of views. Let's see. Yeah, so some comments there. Let's check out some comments before we get started. One of the police issues is that the job attracts the wrong kind of people, and the recruitment process fails to weed them out. That's 1,000 people like that. 220 replies. Thanks for explaining the racist historical context of law enforcement. Most people don't know how deep the roots of racism truly are. 446 likes, 53 replies. As a black man, seeing this and other videos about the state of the country we live in simply reinforces my desire to find a way to get out. I don't think enough people truly understand the constant state of fear that comes with being a person of color in this country, and the thought of having to raise children in the same system. Look at Florida, for God's sake. Now they want to teach that slavery was a benefit. A bunch of likes and all that. All right, so I was been thinking about doing a video about Florida. So I don't know if I'm going to do it or not, but we'll what they want to do and all that. So we cannot look at surface arguments. We cannot, should not, must not look at surface arguments. Look at judging what they would say the book by its cover, reading headlines, and think we understand what the rest of the article is about and what's in the inner and finer details. And so you cannot just look at Florida and say that, oh man, Governor DeSantis wants to eliminate racist or teachings about the historical oppression of black people, or wants to somehow downplay racism or anything like that. That's not what's going on. Although I was not happy or fond of his comments concerning when he was running against Andrew Gilliam, that comment that he made about don't monkey this up and all that. I was not happy about that. But we had to take a look at everything in fuller context and all that. So Without further ado, let's jump into this video. Like I said, I got about 2 minutes in, and I said, I'm going to do a reaction to this. So I have not seen it, so my facial reactions and whatever else is going to be, it's going to be authentic. And keep in mind, once again, for you guys who are just first-time listeners of mine, that I was a police officer for 24 years, 19 years. I was in some type of supervisory capacity. I taught human behavior. I taught to recruits and human behavior, and gosh, I'm almost starting to forget now. What did I teach? I taught defensive tactics, handcuffing techniques. I taught some introductory new classes, the history of law enforcement up until the civil rights, a few other classes. So vast history in law enforcement, and completing a PhD. I'm hoping to finish by September 2023. A few weeks. But the class is actually scheduled to finish by December of 2023. So no matter what, I will have it by December 2023. My PhD in leadership with a concentration in criminal justice. But I'm hoping to get it done because I've submitted everything and all that. So I'm just waiting for the committee review process to do what they got to do, if they wanted me to make any adjustments or anything like that. So that's a little bit about my history. So enough of that. And for anyone who thinks, who the heck is this guy to talk about law enforcement? I don't know who this lady is, Leisha Miller, and why she feels compelled to speak about it. But let's dig into it. So this is a little shot on the screen that says, this video has been edited from its original form. Police in the U.S. are so problematic that we struggle to get this past YouTube's community guidelines and limitations. So let's check this out as it's in its form right now. In my 3 years on YouTube, I never struggled this much to get past video restrictions.
On the evening of May 25th, 2020, officers responded to a call on 38th and Chicago in South Minneapolis of a man reportedly using a forged $20 bill to purchase cigarettes. The man, George Floyd, was sitting in a car with his friend when officers arrived, pulled out their guns, and ordered him out of his vehicle. After handcuffing the man, the officers attempted to put him into their squad car. Floyd resisted, saying he was claustrophobic. During the altercation, a number of other officers, including Officer Chauvin, arrived at the scene. Chauvin pulled Mr. Floyd away from the car at one point, causing him to fall to the ground, where he lay face down, still restrained by handcuffs, apparently in a distressed state. Witnesses began filming as a crowd formed around the altercation. The officers further restrained Mr. Floyd as Chauvin placed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. What followed was 9 minutes of footage that would lead to George Floyd's and weeks of collective uprising against police violence across the United States and throughout the world. A final straw amid global pandemic tensions and after centuries of oppression and murder at the hands of racist police forces. Last month, after a 2-year investigation, the U.S. Justice Department's Civil Rights Division dropped a scathing 89-page report on the Minneapolis Police Department and the city of Minneapolis, finding that what happened to George Floyd was part of widespread, systemic problems in the MPD, a truth that residents here in Minneapolis, where I live, already knew too well. And while corrupt, violent police are not unique to the United States, it is unique among similarly situated Western countries. So I set out to figure out why. What is it about our history, our culture, and our police that set us apart in all measurable ways from other similar countries? The answer is messy and layered, but one thing is clear. We have a serious problem, and serious solutions need to be pushed at every level of government, from your local city council all the way to Congress. This is why U.S. police are so corrupt. Roll the intro. Corby Parker. The DOJ report released last month found that the Minneapolis Police Department uses excessive force, including unjustified deadly force, unlawfully discriminates against Black and Native American people, violates the rights of people engaged in protected speech, and both MPD and the city, led by the absolutely cringeworthy, incompetent Mayor Jacob Frey, discriminate against people with behavioral health disabilities when responding to calls for assistance. The report also found persistent deficiencies in MPD's accountability systems, training, supervision, and officer wellness programs, which contribute to violations of the Constitution and federal law. And while the report was certainly damning, it merely confirmed what residents here, especially Black residents, have known for their entire lives, and it is by no means unique to Minneapolis. police. In the United States, we have the lowest police training requirements of any similar country by far. U.S. police officers are more heavily armed than most other countries, as are the...
Yeah, so far I'm not... I got to disagree with... I got to agree with that. There's been a lot of talk... I'm going to try to open up this can of thing here. There's been a lot of talk about restructuring police training, and she's right about that. She's absolutely right about that. Comparatively speaking, U.S. police are ill-trained. Well, they're certainly well-equipped, but they're ill-trained. And you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, they go to their police academies and come out with degrees, or you got to have a degree before you get into their academies. So I've also lobbied for, or also going to lobby for further training, right?
People they police. In Iceland, Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK, police are largely unarmed. In Iceland, where gun ownership is common, the country has recorded one police-involved shooting death in its history. In Ireland, most police aren't even trained to use firearms. In the UK, police have themselves resisted calls for them to bear arms, saying it goes against their philosophy of policing by consent, meaning that their legitimacy is contingent on public approval of their actions, as opposed to brute force. What a concept. The rate of civilians killed by police annually in the US is more than 3 times higher than Canada and 4 times higher than Australia. And yes, that's controlling for population size. And of course, as we saw in the recent police killing and subsequent riots in France, violence, especially against minorities at the hands of police, is not unique to the United States.
Yeah, I can remember that the whole situation happened in France. I was actually going to do something about that, and I didn't. But she's right. When a French police officer, I think it was over. What was that, back in June? Yeah, I thought it was May or June. But there was a citizen who was killed by the French police, and they started rioting, right? Because that's not the way that they want their system to be governed. And this is problematic, right? And she mentioned what's going on in the UK, and there certainly is a different perspective that goes on within these organizations. One of the big things that has been talked about here in the U.S. is why we have armed our police officers is because we have something that's very unique in consideration of other constitutions, and that is the right to bear arms. Right? That Second Amendment is a game changer when it comes to every police officer. Every confrontation that a police officer walks into, we walk into every confrontation, not only confrontation, which has a negative terminology or negative connotation to it, but every interaction with citizens, we are assuming that the person is armed. When I was teaching and when I was taught, it was called the +1 rule, right? Where I already have a gun on my hip. And we always assume that there was another weapon somewhere on the premises, or in the vehicle that you're driving, or in the backpack that you're carrying. And it was always the presumption. It was always in the back of our mind. It was something that was drilled into our minds and drilled into our heads that this person is armed, and to be careful and cautious. And I would say that the heightened state of awareness, that police officers have, is reasons for their sometimes overactions and overreactions. So not disagreeing with her so far.
But it's the rate of that violence in the US that is staggering. Black people are dramatically overrepresented in the number of police killings in this country. While they make up only 12% of the US population, they represent over a quarter of all killings by police, often while being unarmed, unthreatening, and actively experiencing a mental health crisis. And while current policing standards and tactics are to blame, to get at the root of how we got here, we have to look at our history. In the early American colonies, policing was used as a means of securing private property and businesses from thieves and bandits, usually fueled by fear of Native Americans coming and encroaching on their settlements in the night. So night watchmen and patrols were organized on a local level, and sometimes night watch was even doled out as punishment for misdeeds. In the North, night watchmen were mainly concerned with enforcing puritanical rules against gambling and sex work, though.
Okay, I'm going to pause right there because I don't want to get any strikes or anything. But yeah, she's right. I taught this to my class. I taught a class, Law and Society. I taught a class. This is in a college. I taught this Law and Society, and I taught about the history of law enforcement, and I taught that to police recruits. So I've taught both in the police academies as well as continue to teach in colleges. And so she's right on target right here. So, I'm not disagreeing with her so far at all. And this is a problem, right? This is the origins. This is the origins of law enforcement as it is in America. When you talk about, she's talking about the UK, and that's important because the UK evolved. The UK started their system first under Sir Robert Peel, and then it evolved into law enforcement in the American colonies started to adopt what they were doing, what the UK was doing. It wasn't called the UK, the British were doing whatever, and then it stumped, and then it came over here in the form of night watchmen in the north. And of course, we'll get into. I'm assuming she's going to talk about slave patrols in the south, and this is the origins of law enforcement. So it's already racist, right? So not only were they keeping an eye out on the natives who wanted their land back. But they were also, free blacks were also being policed and patrolled by these same night watchmen. Of course, they were talking about, they were going into gambling and prostitution, et cetera, et cetera.
Because night watch duty was often given as punishment, it often led the night watchmen to engage in the vices they were meant to be policing. Sound familiar? As the South expanded and the slave trade was brought to the colonies, patrolmen and night watchmen were charged with policing enslaved Africans. The slave patrol and slave catchers were the first form of organized police in the South, originating in the colony of Carolina. They were the first professional law enforcers tasked with enforcing the slave codes, stopping any black person they saw, and chasing runaways. The idea of a centralized municipal police force originated in the UK around the turn of the 19th century. In rapidly urbanizing areas, moral reform, enforcement of the laws, and discipline of the new class of industrial laborers was thought to require a strong central policing body to maintain social order.
Yeah, that's important, right? So the infrastructure was growing, industrialization was growing, and so with this growth of these different areas, there's population increase, and so you want to keep everyone under control. And so this is what was going on. So she's, again, I'm assuming that she's done her research and homework. I did not know that she was an attorney before I started this. So anyone who can watch this should watch it and understand that this is an accurate history and portrayal that she is giving.
And it wasn't long before that idea spread to the United States. The Boston Municipal Police Force was started in 1838 in response to influxes of immigrants from Germany and Ireland, immigrants who were seen as dangerous others that required additional surveillance and control.
So this idea of immigration, idea of patrolling others, as she's mentioning, is not unique to African Americans. Irish, Germans, Italians later on, they were all targeted in keeping watch on these different individuals. And it's also interesting because another aspect of this is as these Irish and Germans and Italians and other individuals who were coming over here to the U.S., they came with their own customs and ways of punishing their own in-group persons, right? So we needed a formalized system to monitor, surveillance, punish, etc. So this is the expansion and the development of police forces, right? Because what may work in one community, punishment, what form of punishment may work in one community may not necessarily work in another form. So you needed a controlled, system-wide, nationwide, or citywide, or statewide form of enforcing the laws of rule breakers, right? So this is this is what's going on, right? So surveillance was not something, this targeting of African Americans, and we'll probably get to Chinese Americans and other individuals, right? Any other individuals who've come here have always been looked at with suspicion. There's always been looked at with a need for monitoring. It's always been the case.
Sound familiar? And of course, it wasn't long after then that the police forces started experiencing widespread corruption. By the 1850s, U.S. police forces were prone to the gambling, booze, and sex workers that they were meant to be policing, and police captains and sergeants were appointed by politicians and used to harass their political opponents and to harass voters into voting certain ways. Then came the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which provided that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States.
Just taught a class human trafficking, and I asked I asked this same question: is slavery abolished? No longer in the United States. Everyone just generally answers the question with no. It's untrue. 13th Amendment says except for when there's a crime that's been committed, right? So this is how you can look into convict leasing programs, particularly in the South, where black men in particular were arrested, targeted for not having a job, vagrancy, loitering, etc., and then placed back on the very farms, the very plantations that they had escaped from and fought for their freedom for, and placed right back there. So there was no mass incarceration in comparison to those times. What happened is that mass incarceration is a modern day philosophy modern day principle that came about with the war on drugs. But before that, African American men in particular have always been targeted, always been harassed, always been arrested, but they were placed in plantations, back in the mines, and etc. at that time. And this is post 1865, in particular post 1877, after the Reconstruction period ended.
The Reconstruction era began in the South, along with the passage of the Black Codes, which controlled where formerly enslaved people could go, work, live, travel, and how much they could be paid, essentially criminalizing all forms of black freedom. And because the 13th Amendment explicitly allowed for the enslavement and involuntary servitude of convicted criminals, it meant that the newly freed population of formerly enslaved people were at the mercy of a corrupt police force that knew that once black people were found to be criminals, they would be put back into their place. And thanks to the Black Codes, that pattern of mass incarceration of black people started swiftly. The codes included very broad vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployed black people, and any black person who challenged the terms of their work by negotiating for higher salary, walking away from an abusive employer, or turning down a bad offer would then be criminalized for vagrancy because they were unemployed and therefore no longer protected by the 13th Amendment while incarcerated. And under the convict leasing system, prisons would lease their detainees to private companies who would earn huge profits off the backs of incarcerated black people working in mining, railroads, and other industries.
So there's often been a push for reparations, and they want it for, and I've read a few books about it. Actually, I read one or two books and a couple of academic papers about the argument for reparations. I'm not convinced by it. I think a better argument could be and should be made for reparations based on exactly what we just heard right now, right? African Americans post the Civil War, post the 13th Amendment, and the establishment of Jim Crow, I think that's a better case for reparations, right? Because we had our homes taken from us, burned down, we were put back in chains through corruption means, all at the behest and all at the assistance by the federal government. And so I think that a much better argument could be made and should be made that we as ADOS, African descendants of slaves, foundational black Americans, whatever you want to call this group of people, were systemically targeted with the approval of the government, police officers in the federal government, city governments, state governments, to be targeted, harassed, put back in chains, have everything taken away from you. And in essence, the policing of all forms of black freedom, as she just said. So I think that a better argument should be made, could be made under that pretext. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a reparations expert, and I know that when they talk about reparations, I know that they look at reparations from who else has gotten it within history and who else is getting it through throughout the world, right? Other cultures, other ethnicities, etc. For whatever reasons, they've gotten it. I don't think a good enough argument from what I have read should be made from the argument concerning slave labor. I just don't think that you can make that argument. But I think a better argument is look at the mental anguish that African Americans are dealing with today. Every single marker of indication of life here in America, we are, particularly of those that are negative, we are on the top of, right? From incarceration rates to out of wedlock pregnancies, our wedding rates, our marriage rates, out of wedlock pregnancies, our disease rates. All these, I think, can be traced back not only to slavery, but I think a better formulation can be given that is traced really back to Jim Crow. We have been segregated, kept out of the universities, kept out of hospitals, we've been redlined, not able to access not only education, but we've not been able to access the best places to live. Post freedom, we couldn't defend ourselves. You couldn't own a gun, couldn't own a dog, right? This is why we have gun permits and why we have dog licenses, because only certain people could have them. Right, so we gotta really kind of dig into this type of thing, and I think that a better argument can be made for that. So why are U.S. police so bad? So she's given an exact history that I would give up until George Floyd. I'm not going to play too much longer of this because I think that she's already on target, and there hasn't been anything she said thus far. We're almost halfway through it, so I'll play a little bit more and we'll stop it.
Police, as arbiters and enforcers of the law, served as the ultimate reminder to Black people of their lower status in society, and ensured that wealthy, powerful people could continue to extract labor from Black bodies. And people knew.
And this is post slavery, right? The economic system of slavery was a legal one that was legal and that was profitable to not only the government but to individual slave owners, landowners. Post the Civil War, right? Brand new 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments come in here and are supposed to undo all this type of stuff, particularly the 13th Amendment. You can't have this, but then they end up doing it, right? This is the absolute behest of the federal government. Post Reconstruction, which was from 1865 to 1877. After 1877, it starts the Jim Crow era, and that's when police continued the corruption, continued the targeting of African Americans, continuing to stop, harass, and place them back in chains, place them back in bondage, continuing to drive the economy of this country. We get some other, I think this, I'm not exactly sure of the exact timing of the wars, but we get the War of 1812, we get the Spanish-American War, we get a few other wars in there, and then of course we had what my grandmother would call the Great War or World War I. And African Americans fought in every single one of these wars, including the Civil War, right, for their independence, for the right to be called American citizens. And what has been the repayment for their dedication to the country? Enslavement, persecution at the hands of the police, at the hands of lawyers, at the hands of the medical field, at the hands of the realty field, all with the tacit approval and backing of the United States government. This is, in my estimation, a better case for reparations.
Their police forces were corrupt, especially during Prohibition, when many cops fell in with organized crime rings that proliferated during this period. So in 1929, President Hoover appointed the 11-member Wickersham Commission to examine the corruption in America's law enforcement. Over the course of 2 years, they produced volumes of reports documenting widespread corruption. The resulting reforms included a remapping of police precincts to reduce the chance of political influence, increased recruitment standards, and diversification of police officers from different communities. By the 1950s, reforms in the police force prioritized quote-unquote professionalism.
So, yes, the Wickersham Commission, you talk about that a lot. 1929, however, it's still, what did it do? And that was the 1920s, right? So 1930s, African Americans still being lynched. 1940s, African Americans still being lynched. 1950s, right? This is post the Second World War, 1950s, and now they want to do this thing called professionalism. And that's much the era that we just came out of in policing, the professionalism, 1950s to about the 1980s. And then we got to about the community policing, that particular era, which some have maintained that we've never really fully instituted.
Efforts to consolidate and centralize police forces were intended to help maintain order and prevent corruption. The goal was to create a sense of police omnipresence, so criminals never felt outside the watchful eye of the law. Policing became a full-blown career path, and centralization and the quasi-militaristic ranking within the system caused departments to become more disconnected from the public. And while these reforms
that's an opinion, but that is an opinion, but there is some research that talks about that. I think there was another more research, 1960s, 1970s, talking about, I'm not sure the exact year, time frame, don't quote me on that. But in 1960s, 1970s, maybe even 1980, somewhere around there, there was an initiative to get police officers to stop using the militaristic titles, honorifics, of sergeant, lieutenant, captain, et cetera, and just call them, first officer or other terminology. Never caught on, and it didn't help with, and this is why it's an opinion, because it didn't really help with their interactions with the public. The public still saw them as an occupying force and not officer friendly.
Some of the flagrant corruption in earlier police forces, it did nothing to root out the inherent racism that had existed as the foundational pretext for the existence of those police departments to begin with. And this reality was put on stark display in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, when the new nightly news and newspapers published disturbing photographs of police brutality during street protests, with many cops resorting to horseback, whips, and dogs as a means of controlling the masses. Tactics that harkened back to the original slave chasers from whence the police departments came. In retaliation, Lyndon B. Johnson announced his war on crime through the passage of the Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which created grants for local police to purchase military-grade weapons to suppress riots. This change sent an increasingly militarized police force into largely impoverished black neighborhoods, increasing surveillance and criminalization of those communities. The practice called stop and frisk was all but codified into law in 1968 through the Supreme Court case Terry v. Ohio, which gave police officers legal authority to stop and search someone if they have reasonable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime.
Okay, so here's where she's kind of playing fast and loose. It wasn't as if now keep in mind that before the stop and frisk principle was codified into law, as she would say, that police officers routinely had the right to stop African Americans, and this is where it came from. They routinely had the right to stop African Americans. Go through their stuff, and they didn't have any laws, that any rules, any reasons, any rights that any police officer was bound to judge, was bound by, right? So you take a look at I believe it was the Dred Scott decision in 1950. That was the philosophy that guided much of what was going on here, that black people were not citizens, were not meant to be citizens, and then they were stopped and frisked by the slave catchers, slave patrols, etc. They would routinely be harassed, and that was just part of their routine guidance of principles of what it was to be a police officer. And this was your job, not only to keep law and order, but to keep these particular people in line. So we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment talking about that you have the right to be a citizen, talking about you have the right to vote, and that you have a right to, if you're born in this country, that you're a citizen, and there's no more slavery. So these are these rights, but it never really fully extended to African Americans in practice, right? So this was just words. These were just words on the paper, and so they were never put into practice. So we get this particular case in 1968, post all these wars I talked about, African Americans fought, post World War II, where we had blacks coming back from World War II being lynched in their uniforms, right? Being persecuted in their uniforms, because there was a mentality that they white people just did not have to respect the rights of black people. So you get 1968 in a situation where this guy's walking on the street, and it was just a normal routine that they could just stop anyone and just ask them. So the lawsuit came about and said, this case of Terry versus Ohio, when this guy was just kind of standing there, and the police officer went up to him and wanted to go through his pockets and pat him down and see if he had any weapons on him. Now, this particular case became the case in which it was that the parameters were set, that the bar was set. It wasn't like it was just, she's making it seem as if it was a lowering of the bar. It was actually an elevation of the bar. Prior to this case, Terry versus Ohio, black people were just routinely just stopped, frisked, called Boyd, told to get over here, no rights and everything like that. 1968, with the change in the tone of the country through the Civil Rights Act and different civil rights ideas that were going on, they had to take a look at this case and say, hey, you know what? You've got to, police officers have to have a reason to stop someone. Police officers are given deference because of their experience, because of the things that they've seen, and because they know when things are out of place, right? So because they have this type of understanding, this type of wisdom, this type of institutional wisdom and institutional knowledge, something that the ordinary citizen on the street wouldn't have, because ordinary citizens wouldn't have training and experience. So it was actually an elevation of the bar so they could understand what was going on. And so based on that, they could do a stop, which means they inhibit your freedom. You're no longer free to leave. That's the stop. You're not free to leave. I want to check you out. I want to have a conversation with you to see what's going on. And a frisk is not going through the pockets, not searching of the pockets, but it's a pat down of the outer garments looking for weapons, not for drugs and not for fruits of a crime, but certainly just to see if there was a search for weapons. Why was a police officer given the authority to search for weapons? Because we have something called the Second Amendment in this country. The Second Amendment said that people can walk around with pistols and guns on them. So the police officer should not have to risk his life, his safety, or the lives of everyone else, because there is an influx and because there's this plethora of weapons on the street here in America, even in 1968. So that's the reason that for stop and frisk. And it was actually an elevation in the parameters, right? You have to come up and say, okay, we can't just have police officers stopping willy-nilly black citizens, Asian citizens, Hispanic citizens, and even white citizens because they have a hunch and a feeling. You've got to have an articulable set of circumstances, articulable reasons why a well-trained officer in similar circumstances would say, hey, you know what? There's something not right here, and I'm going to make sure that there's no crime, number one, being committed, and number two, that this person isn't going to harm me with an ice pick or with a gun or whatever. So
frisk was used for decades to disproportionately target young black men and wasn't found to be an unconstitutional infringement against the Fourth Amendment's protection against searches and seizures until 2013.
Okay, so I agree with that. However, I disagree with the spin on it, is that it wasn't found. Okay, you have lawsuits had to be filed about it, and once lawsuits were filed about it, and taking a look at the numbers of individuals being searched, what they were coming up with, the areas that were being searched, the time of day, when they looked at all this type of information, they said, okay, yeah, you guys are really targeting African Americans, you're not coming up with anything, and you're just kind of just stopping individuals without articulable reason, without a reason. And I remember having conversations with people I work with, and I was on a job in 2013. We're like, I don't understand, what this whole thing is about. Why can't we just stop and frisk individuals? Well, that's not the case. The point is that you're stopping them for no reason. Police officers have to have an articulable reason. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means you have to be able to explain what it is about this person's demeanor, their character, their actions, their behavior that is outside of the norm that would cause a reasonable officer to think that this person is doing something wrong, right? In similar circumstances, everyone else is walking through the mall and they're just kind of going about their business. But this one individual keeps putting his hands in his pockets, keep looking over his shoulder, keeps kind of staking things out, looking for where the body cameras are, looking for where security is, checking things out, not really buying anything. Those actions and behaviors are outside the norm of an everyday normal shopper. And so in that particular case, you would have a suspicion that something is up. Now, it could be that this person is paranoid and suffering some mental break or something like that. So it would be right for a police officer to go up to that person and say, hey, listen, Is everything okay, et cetera, et cetera. In order to get to the level of stop, you have to know, or you have to not know, but you have to have a reasonable suspicion that not only are they not having some type, maybe they're having a mental break, but there's also a crime about to be committed. Maybe you see him giving the eye to someone else who's standing by a door, who's ill-fitted, dressed in an ill type of way, not ill type of way, but dressed in an inappropriate type of way concerning the seasons. Maybe they're with a big long trench coat on in the middle of July. That's abnormal. But that trench coat could be hiding a sawed-off shotgun. So this is the reasons that we get into, right? So she's kind of conflating this. I appreciate what she's saying before, but now she's kind of getting off a little bit.
After LBJ's war on crime, Nixon's war on drugs further criminalized the black community by focusing heavily on the policing of heroin, which was running rampant in black communities at the time. And despite the fact that throughout history the police have been used to quell and prevent labor organizing, by the 70s and 80s police unions became a battleground, leading to widespread blue flus, a tactic the police would use to walk out on the job in retaliation for budget cuts or any other perceived wrongdoing. And while today nationwide union membership has dropped from its high in the 80s, higher membership rates among police unions today mean they have strong bargaining power to resist reform and extensive resources to influence campaigns and initiate litigation to block reform. For example, a single New York City police union has spent over $1 million on state and local races in the last decade. And at least one study has...
Yeah, so I've done, if you haven't checked out this, certainly go back. I've done, I think, 2 talks with a union lawyer. Gosh, I forget his name right now. Let me check it out here. Oh yes, I had attorney Jonathan Smith. Will unions continue to fight against reforms, and are police unions the real problems? So check out those particular archives. Talk about police unions.
Shown that after officers gain access to collective bargaining rights, there is a substantial increase in killings of civilians. So where does that leave us today? Today, state and local governments spend about $115 billion on police every year, most of it coming from taxpayer money, plus a $54 million chunk coming from federal funds distributed through grant programs. State to state and even county to county, training for police officers varies widely. In many instances, the hours of training required to become a gun-slinging police officer hover around 650 hours, while becoming a cosmetologist takes 3,000 hours, a plumber 3,500, and a lawyer, on average, 4,725 hours.
So this was something, man, I think it was Colin Kaepernick who said this a couple of years ago, talked about the number of hours that went into becoming a police officer, and they took a lot of heat for that. And I don't know. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I'm going to assume that what she's saying is correct. I know I looked into becoming a therapist, right? Because I have a degree in psychology, looking to getting my certificate of becoming a therapist. And even after I get it, I'd have to do like 3,000 hours.
And that last one, the amount of training it takes to be a lawyer, is important. To write the laws and interpret the laws for clients comes with a bachelor's degree, plus 3 additional years of schooling, multiple internships, and a rigorous bar exam. Not to mention continuing education requirements and ethical standards that must be maintained. Cops are tasked with enforcing the laws that lawyers and legislators write, which requires often split-second interpretation of how the law applies to the specific situation they're responding to, all while holding a loaded gun. And on average, they have about 16 weeks of training, with nothing more than a high school diploma as a prerequisite and no national board of ethics or oversight unless you count the DOJ coming in after a tragedy to do an investigation. Make it make sense. In Europe...
Yeah, so she's going to get into Europe. So this is listen, I agree with that. I mean, she's kind of trivializing it a little bit. What she says, all while holding a gun. Well, these are the split second. These are the split second decisions. These are the situations that we're asking for police officers to enter into and to make these kind of split second decisions. And so, okay, do we need more training? Probably, yeah. I think that we could use that. 16 weeks. I don't think it's 16 weeks of that. 16 weeks is 4 months. I think most national academies now, not national academies, I think most state police academies are around 6 months. And 6 times 20, so you got about 24 months. and that do have continued training that must take place some are every year. State of Connecticut was every 3 years. So she's trivializing it just a little bit. But yeah, I definitely think that there's more training. I think that degrees should be given, more mandated in longer sentences.
Similar training programs require more than 3 years to complete. And as I said, the manner and type of training that police receive varies dramatically throughout the country. But on average, they're receiving 213 hours of operations training, which I assume means how to fill out and file the right paperwork after incidents, followed by 168 hours of firearms, self-defense, and use of force tactics, then 89 hours of self-improvement, unclear what that means, then 86 hours, or a little over 2 40-hour weeks, on legal education.
Well, see, here's the problem. Here's the problem is that this means different things. And I agree that this is a problem. We got to have a national standard as far as law enforcement, right? And there's a CALEA is the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, right? So in order to, and I don't, okay. So this particular organization is a gold standard, as they're saying, for public safety. This is what people should do in order to become accredited, yada, 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 yada. Okay, but the problem with this is that there's no incentive really to get to it and to hold to it and to get this accreditation. What does that mean? I mean, does it mean you get more federal funding? Does it mean if your police department is involved in a shooting that you won't be defended? It doesn't mean anything, and that's kind of problematic. I mean, it's nice to say and have, but what is the penalty? I guess it's saying too much to say it doesn't mean anything. But what is the penalty for not having that? Do your insurance rates go up for your city? They should. Should that be somehow connected to the educational attainment of whether you get educational grants for your city? It should. Do you not get federal funding for your roads if your police department is not accredited? All of this should happen as a form of incentives to get law enforcement to hold to a certain national accreditation standard. So operations, I don't know what that means either. I don't know what that means. Firearm self-defense, okay, that's fighting on the ground, probably taser, some OC spray training, self-improvement, 89 hours of self-improvement. What to do after self-improvement. I mean, probably how to eat right, work out, exercise. It's probably all contained in that. Legal education, right? Laws of arrest, criminal laws, motor vehicle laws, domestic violence training, mental health training. It's not enough. I mean, I agree with that sentiment. It's not enough.
2 weeks on legal education, followed by a grand total of 13 hours of domestic violence training and 10 hours of mental health training. This despite the fact that most police killings start in response to non-violent offenses, cases where no crime was reported, and situations in which the victim was having a mental health crisis. Approximately 1 in 4 people shot and killed by police between 2015 and 2020 showed signs of mental illness. And there are mixed reports on whether the police are even effective at curbing crime at all, especially in cities with large black populations. In those cities, research has shown that increasing police presence does nothing to curb violent crime, and instead increases the rate of arrest for petty, non-violent crime, like loitering and disorderly conduct, unnecessarily siphoning black people, especially black youth, into the criminal justice system. A recent study...
Yeah, I've read some of those studies, and I have to agree that it's you really want to stop crime, you have to invest in the children, invest in education, invest in jobs, and that's what's going to stop crime. And from a public perspective and from the citywide efforts, what they should do, this is vastly out of the control of most public officials, but that's certainly a starting place. And yeah, police are primarily not crime fighters, according to the data. Yeah, this is problematic.
Of the California police force found that LA County sheriff's officers spent 88% of their time on officer-initiated stops, and 79% of that time was spent on traffic violations. About 3 out of every 4 hours that Sacramento sheriff's officers spent investigating traffic violations were for stops that ended in warnings or no action. More of the...
Yeah, so Yeah, this is yeah. So this is the whole broken windows theory. The whole idea of you can get more action done by stopping the little things. Stopping individuals for broken taillights and things along those lines, and hoping to catch individuals who have broken the law and maybe have warrants. But it's not an effective tool. You want to stop crime, you have to stop the causes of crime, and the causes of crime are low education. The causes of crime are lack of incentives and no jobs, right? So you give people jobs, work, give them work to go to, and increase their educational attainment, and crime will decrease. So
that Sacramento sheriff's officers spent investigating traffic violations were for stops that ended in warnings or no action. More of the department's budget was going towards fruitless traffic stops than in response to 911 calls, basically wasting millions of public dollars, especially considering that Black people were more than twice as likely than white residents to be stopped by sheriff's deputies in some of those counties. So we have an undertrained, heavily militarized, ineffective police force that's been found time and again to abuse its power, especially towards people of color, especially towards Black people. But we also have a country where its citizens are armed to the in teeth, with very little by way of public assistance for mental health and addiction services, where most of its population is one $500 emergency away from homelessness, where a large portion of its population is actively experiencing homelessness, and where there is no safety net, and where institutionalized racism has left entire groups of people disenfranchised and economically bereft, all conditions that lead to increased levels of crime and incarceration in a community that is already overly policed and overly incarcerated. It's a mess.
Okay, so she's going to go on to where do we go from here. Listen, scaling this, rating this, I would say that I gave her an A-. She had a couple of things that I did not agree with in her phrasing of things, but overall, this is where this comes from. So if you want to check out the rest of her video, I don't want to steal all her thunder, so go check out what her recommendations are. I'm going to tell you what my recommendations are. We have to massively put effort and money into our educational system. We have to massively fund our mental health facilities. We have to massively put forth an effort to actually train our police officers. Consider taking their guns away. Oh man, I know every cop's gonna jump on me for that. How can you even say that? Well, and listen, I wouldn't advocate for that unless we're somehow going to take away guns from the ordinary citizen, right? Our citizenry is massively and heavily armed. That's never going away. The Second Amendment is not going to be reinterpreted to say that that's not the case. That we don't have the right to bear arms. So absent those factors, of course, I would not advocate for disarming the police. But I do think we ought to massively put forth efforts to train our police officers effectively, take more time to train them. It's going to take 3 years, right? It should come out with bachelor's degrees. I think it should take 2 to 3 years to train our police officers, every single scenario. In that time, okay, what more can we training? We can get more time in legal training. Listen, why not train them? I look at that movie, look at the movie or the series. I think it's even a comic book, Judge Dredd, right? We ought to consider that, right? These people write the laws, they interpret the laws, and then we're supposed to go out there in split second make decisions about these things. We ought to have an understanding about these things. We ought to have a greater understanding of how to apply them, have a greater understanding of, we saw how much time average was devoted to weapons training and defensive tactics training. I think you ought to go to the police academy and come out a Brazilian jiu-jitsu expert. Learn how to fight on the ground. If you're more comfortable with fighting on the ground, more comfortable in fighting, then your apprehensiveness and your ability to go to the gun will not be the first instinct that comes to your mind. So I think the greater training with physical use of force, more time with firearms training, and not restrictive firearms training, when we should pull out our guns, should and should not pull out our guns, when we should use our weapons, when we should OC spray people, when we should not OC spray people, how to deal with mentally handicapped individuals. I think that we need all these types of things. there may be a major overhaul to what it takes to become a police officer and what it takes, particularly because nobody wants to do it now. We may have to, there's some countries that also I think it's like Korea. There was mandatory civil service in the form of mandatory engagement within the military. You have to join the military for 2 years or 2 or 3 years or something like that. We might have to consider that for law enforcement. Every good, healthy adult, male and female, may have to do some time in police work, right? Just to get on a rotational system. I don't know. We have to start thinking outside the box. Nobody wants to become police officers because of the current climate. She talked about George Floyd, that whole incident. Before then, there was a depolicing effort, and she called it the blue flu. After Rodney King, there was a blue flu, call it depolicing effort. And then you get Michael Brown, another one, Ferguson, Missouri. There was another depolicing effort where people don't want to join the police ranks. And now you get George Floyd. There's another incident in which people don't want to become police officers. So we got to start thinking outside the box. We got to start doing something to make it more and throwing money at the problem is not it, right? Throwing money at it is not going to solve the problem. We've got to solve these societal issues. We've got to solve them, right? I think the institutional racism thing, okay, it might be gone in the past, and there certainly are some communities who are still targeting African Americans. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. But on the other side of the coin is we got to take a look at what our policies are and what our practices are concerning our mentally ill, our mentally ill, those who have come back from these wars that we've sent our men and women into. Take a look at our homelessness, take a look at our job situation, take a look at our educational system, right? This is why education matters to me so much, right? I've never been an educator, but it matters, right? And so we've got to take a look at all this if we want to stop this rate that on where we're going. So she answered the question of why are U.S. police so bad. We're going to leave it off right there. Let me know your thoughts, your opinions. Do you agree with it and all that? She hasn't said anything that I have not said in my own talks and speeches concerning all that. And I don't know I'm going to stop it right here. I am going to take a listen to the rest of her spiel as to what she thinks we should do from here. But I want you all to check it out. I don't want to take all her thunder. So let me know your thoughts, your opinions. Till next time, much love and peace.